They found her body at dawn near the back wall of the city, not in a bed, not in a home, just there, half covered in wet rags, one hand curled around a piece of broken bread, the other reaching toward nothing. No one screamed, no one wept, because no one was surprised. If this is your first time hearing how women like her were treated in death, brace yourself. What happened to prostitutes in the Middle Ages after they died wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. And if you think the church offered comfort, or that the state gave them dignity, you're about to see a very different truth. Subscribe if you want more untold stories like this. And in the comments, tell me, should a human being ever be denied a grave? Her name was Alys, though even that would be forgotten. She had no husband, no land, no family left to speak of, just the bruises on her collarbone, the cough that never stopped, and the memory of better days she didn't dare trust anymore. The night before her death, Alys had been standing beneath the archway near the fish market, wrapped in a wool cloak that wasn't hers. The rain soaked her hair, but she didn't move, not even when the cart rolled by and splashed mud across her feet. She'd been still for hours, watching, waiting, hoping a man would stop without raising a hand. One did. He paid in copper. He left in silence. No one saw her fall. No one saw her stagger against the wall, press her hand to her ribs, and whisper a name that wasn't hers. The fever had been growing for days. It came with blood in her breath and a chill she couldn't sweat out. When she finally collapsed near the dung heap, a stray dog sniffed at her legs. It didn't bite. It just walked on. At sunrise, the butcher's apprentice was the first to spot her. He paused, squinted, and made the sign of the cross. Not for her, but for himself. Then he walked away to tell the guards. 2 hours later, her body was still there. A pair of city watchmen arrived, yawning into their gloves. One poked her gently with the shaft of his halberd. Dead, he said, maybe plague. The other spat. Not worth the shovel. They didn't call a priest. They didn't fetch a cart. They didn't even close her eyes. Instead, they argued about jurisdiction. Was she inside the city limits or just outside? Did she fall under parish law or the council's? Could her body be dragged to the rubbish pit without paperwork? Would the church fine them for touching a sinful corpse? Meanwhile, the rats had begun to gather, and high above, from the window of a stone building with red shutters, a clerk paused with his ink-stained hands and watched. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she had suffered or what she had survived. But something in the way her arm was bent, palm half open to the sky, unsettled him. He set down his quill. He watched. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't look away. The rain started again just before noon. Not a storm, just a steady, miserable drizzle that soaked through cloaks and seeped between cobblestones. Her body was still there. No one had come to move it. By mid-afternoon, the city's rhythm carried on around her like she wasn't even there. Market stalls reopened. Children chased each other through puddles. A merchant cursed loudly at his broken wheel, not 10 paces from her outstretched hand. Alys, if anyone still remembered the name, was now just an obstruction, a pile of damp flesh with no owner and no claim. Finally, a man in a dark robe arrived. He was not a priest, not really. Brother Edric had been suspended twice by the bishopric, but still wore the habit. They called him when no one else wanted to do the work. She was a whore, he said flatly, staring down at her. They don't get burial rites. The city clerk had followed him, hat in hand, trying not to show discomfort. But the body, she's not a body, she's evidence of sin. And if we bury her in consecrated ground, the bishop will scream bloody heresy. He turned to the guards, still loitering by the wall. Where's the cart? They shrugged. Brother Edric sighed, pulled a cloth from his belt and covered her face, partly out of routine, partly because he didn't want to look at the bruises. The cart arrived an hour later, pulled by a mule that had seen better years. The driver didn't ask questions, he never did. He just waited for the guards to hoist her up by the arms and toss her onto the wooden plank like a sack of waste. Her head hit the side with a thud. The driver winced. Brother Edric didn't blink. They took her to the edge of the city, to a patch of earth behind the tanner's yard, where the smell of rotting hides hung in the air like poison. It wasn't a cemetery. It wasn't even marked on most maps. But this was where they brought the unclaimed, the unknown, the unwanted. The field of silence, some called it. No stones, no names, just ground that had been dug so many times it barely held shape anymore. Shallow pits filled with mud and lime. A half-burned wooden cross lay in the grass, kicked over long ago. Brother Edric dismounted, adjusted his robe, and opened a book of prayers. He didn't read from it. He just held it open. The guards dropped Alys into the pit like they were unloading coal. One of them lit a torch. and held it out. The other opened a sack of quicklime and began to pour. The powder hissed as it touched the wet fabric of her dress. Steam rose. "May the Lord have mercy," Edric said without meaning it. Then they shoveled earth, not much, just enough to make sure the dogs wouldn't dig. No markers, no words, no memory. The cart rattled back toward the city, lighter now. But not everyone was done watching. Behind a crumbling fence, half hidden by ivy and moss, stood a boy, barefoot, no older than 10. He had seen the whole thing. He didn't understand all of it, but he saw enough to know this wasn't how people were supposed to be buried. He waited until they were gone. Then he crept to the edge of the pit and looked down at the dirt. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just stood there, biting his lip, and whispered a single word: "Sorry." That night, a meeting was held in the back room of the city chancery. The clerk, who had watched from the window, stood with his ledger, unsure what to do with the note he had written earlier. "Unidentified woman deceased, found near south wall, discarded. Should I log her?" he asked. "Why?" another man replied, older, with a heavy chain of office around his neck. "No family, no title, no tithe. If we record every dead whore in the city, we'll need a second archive." The clerk hesitated. She had a name. "Do you know it?" "No." Then she didn't. The men around the table chuckled. Outside, the rain washed over the empty stones, and the mud swallowed the last trace of her. In the heart of the city, behind the cathedral's stained glass glare and the velvet curtains of privilege, the question of burial was not merely about death. It was about judgment, not by God, but by men. Brother Edric returned to the monastery before dawn. His boots were caked with the filth of the field of silence, and he left muddy footprints all the way to the dormitory door. No one asked where he'd been. They never did. He wasn't welcome at the high altar anymore. His role was to cleanse what others wouldn't touch. He sat on the edge of his cot and stared at his hands. The lime had burned tiny blisters into his skin. He didn't flinch. It was the 5th burial that week, and all of them women. He lit a candle and opened his personal journal. Not the official book of rites, but a rough-bound notebook he kept hidden in the folds of his robe. On the first page, "Burials not blessed," he added a line, no name, just a date, a notch in the endless anonymous record of the condemned. Meanwhile, at the edge of the city, the earth still steamed. The quicklime continued to hiss and eat through fabric and skin. Her dress, what remained of it, had fused with the soil. The smell of ammonia and decay rose like a veil, but no one came. No one stood vigil, because in the eyes of the church she had already been judged. The doctrine was clear. Prostitutes were women of mortal sin. Their choices, not their poverty, not their abuse, not their hunger, made them enemies of salvation. Unless they confessed and repented before death, they were denied burial in hallowed ground. No sacraments, no candles, no bells, just lime and dirt. But the doctrine had holes. It didn't explain what to do when a child was born to a woman like Alys. It didn't say how to handle the rare, impossible moment when a prostitute gave up her life to save someone else. And it certainly didn't know what to do with men, high-born men, priests, nobles, who visited these women by night and condemned them by day. The hypocrisy was ancient and public, but never punished. In the cathedral archives deep below the nave were scrolls and letters hidden from view. Among them, a parchment written decades earlier by a bishop who had tried briefly to change the custom. He had argued for mercy, for at least a patch of blessed earth near the wall. But the suggestion was dismissed as dangerous leniency. His name was struck from the record. No one spoke of him anymore. Outside, the marketplace buzzed again. Meat hung from hooks. Fish eyes stared blankly from baskets. Bread baked in open hearths. Life forgot the dead quickly here, but not everyone did. The boy who had watched from the fence came back that night. He brought a stone, not a large one, just something smooth and flat enough to sit above the dirt without sinking. He placed it gently at the edge of the mound, unsure if it would stay. Then he picked a piece of string from his pocket, tied it around a twig, and stuck it upright in the ground, a sign, a marker. It meant nothing to the world, but it meant everything to him. He didn't know her name, but he'd seen her once, months ago, when she'd given his sister a crust of bread outside the baker's alley. She hadn't asked for coin, she hadn't said a word. She'd just knelt and offered it with both hands, as if it was gold. That memory had never left him, and now neither would she. The next morning, a dog found the stone. It sniffed once, barked at nothing, and walked on. But a passerby noticed a woman, older, carrying a sack of herbs. She paused at the sight of the stick, the string, and the freshly disturbed earth. Her face tightened, and she whispered something under her breath. A prayer or a warning. She returned the next day and the day after that, and by the end of the week, the grave was no longer alone. 2 more stones had joined it, crude, uncarved, and ignored by all but the flies. But they were there, and they were watched. The burial had no witness, no priest, no family, no final rites. But it left a mark, not in memory, not in song, but in earth. The city's waste field, once just a forgotten patch of ground behind the tannery, had become something else. Not a graveyard, not quite, but no longer empty. 3 stones, 3 lives the world had discarded, buried without names, without prayers, without purpose. Except someone remembered. The boy returned again, this time carrying a piece of cloth. He didn't know where it came from, probably torn from a tradesman's sack or stolen from a washing line. But it was clean. He folded it carefully and laid it across the top of the smallest mound. Then he sat. For over an hour he sat in the damp, quiet field, listening to the wind, watching the sky. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Only once did he glance toward the city wall, as if waiting for someone or something to interrupt. No one came, but someone had noticed him. From the far side of the field, a man stood in the shadow of the tannery wall. Not a priest, not a clerk, just a man in plain brown robes holding a stack of broken crates. He watched the boy with tired eyes, then turned and disappeared inside. Later that day, the crates became firewood, and one piece, polished, light, with a jagged edge, was set aside. That night, the man returned. He waited until the stars were out, until the street patrol had passed, until even the dogs had stopped barking. Then he crossed the waste field alone, shovel in hand, and stopped at the grave with the cloth. He didn't dig, he knelt, and with a small knife pulled from his sleeve, he carved something into the wood, shallow, uneven lines, not letters, just shapes, symbols, a circle, a cross, a curve, like a wave. He placed it in the dirt, pressed it deep. Then he stood, dusted off his knees, and left the field the way he came, without a sound. In the morning, the mark was still there. By noon, it was gone. Someone, likely a city laborer, had found it, declared it garbage, and tossed it behind the tannery. The stick lay broken in the mud, its carvings half scuffed, unreadable. The cloth remained, but the boy didn't return that day nor the next. Alys's grave was once again just a mound of dirt until the 4th night. That night, the wind changed, blew hard from the west, carrying ash from the bakeries and soot from the blacksmiths. The smell of the tannery thickened, turned sour, and in the street beyond the field a woman screamed, not in fear, in labor. She had no husband, no midwife, no family nearby, only blood, pain, and the stone beneath her back. She screamed until her throat gave out, and then screamed more. The guards didn't come, the priests didn't come, but a girl did, barely more than 16, barefoot, hair wrapped in linen, arms smeared with soot. She knelt beside the woman, pressed cloth to her brow, and whispered nonsense words like they were magic. The child came just before dawn, silent, small, slick, with the last warmth of the mother's body. But the mother didn't survive. She died, with her eyes open, fixed on the sky. The girl sat beside the corpse for hours, rocking the baby, silent as the stones. She didn't weep, didn't ask for help. No one noticed her leave the body in the waste field. No one saw her wrap the child in her apron and vanish into the alleys. By the time a city clerk arrived, alerted by the stench, the body had begun to swell. Another woman, another sin, another burden for the lime pit, and no one asked her name. They didn't know it was Lena, didn't know she once served at the bishop's table, didn't know she was turned out for refusing a nobleman's hand, didn't know she starved for 6 days before selling herself. They only knew her body had to be removed, quickly, quietly. Brother Edric was summoned again. He recognized her face but said nothing. He ordered the same as always, cart, pit, lime. But when the guards lifted her body, a small wooden token fell from her sleeve, just a sliver, shaped like a teardrop. No one knew what it meant. They buried it with her anyway. Two graves now lay side by side, both fresh, both without names, but not without memory, because the girl with the child had seen, she knew, and she would not forget. The city didn't stop. It never did. Bread still rose in ovens, metal still rang in forges. Children still threw stones at rats in the alleys. And no one spoke of the two new graves behind the tannery. No one asked what names had been erased. No one wondered what sins had been punished with silence. But inside a small room above the dye house, 4 women sat on the floor with the shutters drawn. They hadn't come to pray. They weren't even friends. Just 4 women who had once worked the same corner, who had shared walls, blankets, bruises, and who had watched Alys disappear one day and not return the next. "She's dead," said the one with the burned hands. Her name was Rika. Her voice was flat. "Saw the cart go past." No one replied. "Buried her near the tannery. No bell, no priest. Still silence." Finally, the youngest, Maud, not even 20, wrapped her arms around her knees and whispered, "Did she ask for it?" The others stared at her and then away. "Didn't ask for nothing," Rika said. "Just tried to live." The 4th woman, Mira, rubbed her forehead like it hurt. "She gave me half a loaf 2 nights before. Said she found it in the gutter, but it wasn't dirty. Said I needed it more." "She never took from no one," said the 3rd. "Except herself," Mira muttered. They fell silent again. Below the window, a bell rang. Market hour. Maud stood, brushed off her skirts, and reached for the tin mirror nailed crooked to the wall. "We'll end up there too, won't we?" she said, more to the glass than to them. No one answered, because no one wanted to lie. At the chancery, the city's scribes were busy drafting new ordinances. There had been complaints about beggars, vagrants, undesirables cluttering the alleys. Undesirables meant many things. Mostly it meant women without husbands, without money, without a clear role to play in the city's plans, especially those who sold their bodies. The proposed law was simple. Loitering after sunset would result in arrest. A second offense, banishment. Third, branding. There were no provisions for where such women might go instead. No offer of shelter, no promise of safety. Brother Edric sat in the back of the meeting hall, his robe damp from another burial. He said nothing. He always said nothing. But his hands trembled slightly as he folded the minutes into his pocket. Outside, a group of young men jeered at a woman with a torn dress. One of them threw a crust of bread at her feet. She didn't pick it up. That night, Mira lit a candle in the dye house and began to write. She had no training, no schooling, but she had watched a scribe once, and she remembered the shape of the letters. She wrote, "Her name was Alys. She shared bread with the hungry. She helped me up when I was too drunk to stand. She kept her bruises quiet. She made us laugh when we forgot how. She is buried behind the tannery. They did not give her a name, but I do." She folded the note, wrapped it in waxed linen, and walked through the night until she reached the field. She placed the bundle beneath a stone at the base of the second grave, and then she ran. 3 days later, the boy returned. He'd come alone, carrying something wrapped in cloth, a doll, small and wooden, with eyes made of ink and hair made of string. He had carved it himself, the way his grandfather had taught him, before his hands stopped working. He didn't know who the new grave belonged to, but he placed the doll between the 2 mounds. Then he sat in the grass and sang, not words, just sounds. Someone heard him. A man with a wine cart paused at the edge of the field. He didn't speak. He only watched. Later that week, that same man returned and left a cup of honeyed wine beside the graves. Later still, a candle appeared, then another, then flowers. By the end of the month, there were 6 mounds, no names, but no longer forgotten. In a city where names were currency and silence was protection, memory became an act of defiance. The 6 graves stood in uneven rows now, each marked not by headstones but by fragments. A doll, a candle stub, a cup, a prayer tied to a stick, a stone engraved with a crude heart, a child's shoe. They meant nothing to the council. They meant everything to those who had nothing else. By now, whispers had spread. The whore's field, some called it. Others said the place of no bells. A few spit at the mention, but more than a few walked slower as they passed the edge of the tannery. Some even paused. The guards noticed, so did the church. At the cathedral, Father Berin, grey-bearded, thin as ash, voice like parchment, stood behind the altar and thundered against it. "This shrine," he spat, This mockery of sacred burial is a danger. It invites sympathy for the unclean. It encourages remembrance where the Lord has called for erasure. The congregation nodded, most of them. One young man in the back did not. His hands were folded, but his jaw clenched. He was a scribe, apprentice to the bishop's treasurer, quiet, polite, but not blind. His name was Alys, and he had seen Alys. Not as a customer, not as a judge, as a human being. He had once passed her in the rain outside the law courts, shivering against the stone wall. She hadn't asked for coin, she hadn't looked up. But when his scrolls spilled from his satchel, she'd knelt, gathered them, and handed them to him, her fingers trembling but precise. He had thanked her. She had said nothing. He remembered that moment as clearly as the letters he copied each day. That night, Elias waited until the cathedral bell rang midnight, then crept through the alley behind the chancery, cloak drawn tight. He carried a small parcel, paper, charcoal, wax. At the waste field, he knelt beside the graves. He lit no candle. Instead, he pressed the parchment to the dirt, weighted it with a stone, and wrote, "They buried her here because she had no name, but names can be given. They buried her here because she had no prayers, but prayers can be spoken. They buried her here because no one claimed her. I do." He signed nothing. He folded the paper, tucked it into a crack in the largest stone, and left before the first light touched the sky. The next day, someone read it and copied it. By dusk, 3 versions of the letter had appeared, one near the tannery gate, one nailed to a stable door, and one left on the cathedral step. Father Berin tore them down in fury. He called for inquiries, for searches, but no one confessed. The women in the dye house denied knowledge. The guards shrugged. Even Brother Edric, when questioned, merely looked past the priest's shoulder and said, "She fed the poor." Berin's face turned purple. "Who?" "The one in the second grave," Edric said. "She gave a coin to the baker's widow. I saw it. Didn't report it then. Reporting it now." The silence that followed was thick as rain clouds. He was dismissed from his duties within the week, but by then it was too late. Because names had begun to return. Not real names, not legal ones, but stories, descriptions, memories, etched in whispers. The woman with the red braid. The girl who sang in the alleys. The one who shared her cloak. They appeared on scraps of cloth carved into bark, traced with coal on stones. The graves multiplied, 9, then 11, and one day 12, fresh earth, no ceremony. But the boy with the doll was there, so was the woman with the herb sack, so was Elias. Standing in the shadow of the wall, and in the center of the field, someone placed a small sign, not of wood, but of iron, bent, rusted, stolen from a fence. On it, just one word, remember. The iron sign stood for 3 days before anyone dared touch it. It wasn't much. Just a rusted rail spike flattened with a hammer, the letters etched not with tools, but with heat. Remember, no names, no dates, just that. On the 4th morning, a city watchman named Jurd knocked it over with the heel of his boot. It bent sideways into the mud. He didn't even stop walking. He was late for breakfast, and the priest had told them to clear that place. But by sunset, it was standing again. No one saw who did it. The next day, someone left a jar of milk. Another left a child's drawing, a stick figure with wild hair, smiling, arms outstretched. The wind tore it within the hour, but someone collected the scraps and tucked them into the crook of one of the stones. At the chancery, the council debated whether to wall off the field. "People are beginning to talk," said the magistrate. "They're starting to treat it like a shrine." "Then let's scatter the graves," someone muttered. "Burn the field." But no one moved, not yet. Because to act now would mean admitting it mattered, so they waited. And the field grew, 16 graves, then 19, then 22. Some were new, others old bones reburied in secret by hands that had no blessing but carried mercy. Elias kept returning, always at night, always alone. He brought with him small tokens, pressed herbs, folded prayers, dried apple peel, each left in silence, each stolen away by the wind. He never spoke of it, not to his master, not to the bishop, not even in confession, but he remembered Alys. He remembered how the world had looked away when she collapsed, and how it kept looking away every time another woman vanished into silence until silence refused to hold. One morning, a noblewoman named Iseline passed by the waste field with her maid. Her cart halted briefly, the wheels sinking in mud. She looked out and saw a child, barefoot, muddy-kneed, planting something beside one of the stones. "What is she doing?" she asked. "Digging weeds, probably." But the child wasn't digging, she was planting wild rosemary, Alys's rosemary. Iselin watched. And later that evening she returned on foot. The guard at the cathedral saw her walk the long path past the tannery and vanish into the trees. He didn't follow, but the next morning there were fresh rose petals scattered across the center of the field. No one said her name, but her footsteps had left dents in the grass. On the first day of Lent, a man approached the graves with a shovel. He wore the cloth of a church brother, but kept his hood drawn. In his hand was a sack of dry lime. Standard procedure, except he didn't go to the edge of the field. He walked to the center, to the grave with the iron sign. He stood over it for a long time, and then, instead of digging it up, he knelt, poured the lime not into the soil, but into a small wooden box. He packed it carefully, closed the lid, and carried it away. No one ever found out who he was. But in the cathedral basement, 3 weeks later, the bishop's assistant discovered a box beneath the steps. Inside, dried lime, wilted rosemary, and a torn page from a ledger. On it, a single line: "They buried her without a name, but I give her mine." The assistant never reported it. He just returned the box to the dark. Years passed. The waste field became a garden, not officially, not publicly, but someone cleared the weeds, someone planted ivy, someone built a low stone ring around the oldest grave. And when children asked what it was, mothers said, "That's where the quiet women sleep." They didn't explain more. They didn't have to, because the story had passed from paper to breath, from law to memory. In every home that knew hunger, in every alley where women whispered warnings to each other, in every pair of eyes that had ever watched someone disappear without cause. Her name lived, not Alys, not Lena, not any of the names written in salt and erased by rain, but the names spoken with flowers, with silence, with refusal to forget. They tried to erase them, but the earth remembered, and someone always came back.